Hello, and many thanks for joining us on the program, People, Politics, and Power. I am Imonia Marire. On August 9 every year, the global community marks the International Day of the World's Indigenous Peoples. The day was set aside by the United Nations General Assembly on December 23, 1994, in its Resolution 49/214 to promote the rise and celebrate the communities of indigenous peoples. But who are the indigenous people? The United Nations defines them as inheritors and practitioners of unique cultures and ways of relating to people and the environment. It says they are peoples who have retained social, cultural, economic, and political characteristics that are distinct from those of the dominant societies in which they live. They are peoples who are determined to preserve, develop, and transmit to future generations their ancestral territories and their ethnic identities as the basis of their continued existence as people. In the estimation of UNESCO, indigenous peoples live in all regions of the world and own, occupy, or use some 22% of global land area. The number at least 370 to 500 million and represents the greater part of the world's cultural diversity. They speak an overwhelming majority of the world's estimated 7,000 languages and represent 5,000 different cultures. However, according to the United Nations, indigenous peoples are among the most disadvantaged and vulnerable groups in the world. They share common problems related to the protection of their rights and distinct peoples. They seek recognition of their identities, way of life, and right to traditional lands and natural resources, which the UN says have been violated throughout history. Now, the focus of this year's observance is on the youth as agents of change for self-determination, with special attention on climate action, mobilizing for justice, and intergenerational connections. Now, on the program today, we shall examine the challenges faced by indigenous peoples all over the world, and in particular in Nigeria. Are there recognized indigenous peoples in Nigeria? How and why are they so referred to? The UN says special measures are required to protect indigenous peoples. What are those special measures? What is and should be the role of governments in this regard? These are the issues we'll be looking at on the program today, and when we return from this short break, we will be meeting our guest analysts. Stay with us. All right, thank you so much for staying with us. So let's get to meet our guest analysts. Two of them are right here in the studio, and one other is joining us virtually via Zoom. First, from my immediate left is Hands-Free Ajanaku. Mr. Ajanaku is the Programs and Communications Manager, Resource Center for Human Rights and Civic Education. Thank you so much for joining us.
I'm a privilege to be here.
Also joining us is a familiar face, Faith Nwadishi, is the Executive Director, Center for Transparency and Advocacy, and she is or has been very active in the area of the welfare of indigenous peoples. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me. Good afternoon, Nigerians.
And joining us via Zoom is a youth from the Federal Capital Territory, Abuja, Jacob Sananu. Jacob Sananu is, of course, a member of the indigenous peoples of the Federal Capital Territory. Right, he will be joining us in a short while. Thank you so much for finding time to join us.
Thank you.
First, let's go on an exploratory note. Who are the indigenous peoples of the world? Why are they so referred?
Thank you so much. I think your introduction actually captures very aptly the United Nations definition of who the indigenous people are. But in a nutshell, indigenous people are people who can lay claim to the originality of a place. That's because they have a distinct language. Before development, they were the ones who were in a particular place. And in Nigeria, there are some indigenous groups you can refer to, those people who can trace their history to where they are presently residing, or people who they have taken away from where they are residing because of development. For instance, if you want to look at a very typical picture of a definition of who the indigenous people are in Nigeria, we'll take the Abuja original inhabitants, and you will take the Oyo Empire as it is. You know, they have been there, they have lived there, they have spoken the same language, they have a distinct culture, and we have some small indigenous groups across Nigeria. And you know that one thing that defines the fact that you're an indigenous group in a particular place is if you can talk about your history, your language, your culture, to a particular place over a very long period of time. Not that you have migrated to that place, but you can actually trace your history to that particular place. It gives you the rights of indigenship of that place where you are, different from the individual that has come to meet you where you are and intermingled your culture. For instance, let me tell you a particular culture of the original inhabitants of the FCT. There's this cultural dressing that they have that they call bache. That's Bache culture. You can find that it is indigenous to the people of the FCT. Every other person that has come into the FCT came with their own culture, their own distinct way, but it does not take away the fact that the original culture of the people of the place where you have come to meet them and they have dealt in that place, that's what gives you that definition and falls within the United Nations definition for an indigenous person.
Hans-Free, that definition appears to be a bit restrictive. For instance, there are many communities in Nigeria, many cultures in Nigeria that will claim indigenous status. The Yorubas, for instance, the Hausas, for instance, the Fulanis, the Urobos, and as many of them as possible, who, according to the definition put forward by Faith, would claim, could lay claim to being indigenous people because they have a long history of their settlement in those places. They have a history of their ownership of the territories and the languages that are indigenous to them. So why is it that the United Nations appear to restrict this definition to just a few?
Yes, so I think one fundamental point, and if you look at the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People and other extant instruments, that speak to the rights of indigenous people, there's a fundamental point, around the notion of identification, that indigenous people, have a right to identify as such. And so the UN has, always tried to move away from the idea of a definition, more to the idea of identification, because, that preserves the rights of the people. And one other dimension of it is how the indigenous people see themselves in relation to the dominant groups, in that particular space. And so they can assert that right, to their indigenous, status by saying, we are committed to the preservation of our culture, and our lives and our livelihoods are connected to certain key resources. For example, the land. For example, you talk about fishing communities. For example, you talk about, the relationship between indigenous group and even natural resources. So some of those key components of the discussion are some of the unique identifiers that the UN has tried to use to differentiate, so that it doesn't become an all-comers affair. Everybody saying I'm indigenous where they are not. We know that there are indigenous groups in Nigeria, for example, who are not, in a sense, coming to the UN to say we are indigenous. That does not remove their rights, and their, the fact that they are indigenous to those places. But for those who have now stepped out, they are seeing an erosion of their culture. They are seeing the fact that livelihoods are being attacked. So that indigenous question is a way to also mobilize the global public opinion to say that attention should be focused on their issues against the background of the robust bouquet of rights that has been created under the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples.
In countries like Australia and New Zealand, they refer to certain groups of people as aborigines. Is there a distinction between aborigines and indigenous peoples?
Okay, so the nomenclature around the aborigine and the indigenous people is the fact that you have aborigines described as the original owners of a place. These people have been here, and depending on the different kind of cultures that you have had, people have had different definitions, and that's why you have, for instance, when we went to the UN recently and we are talking about the original inhabitants, they told us that the nomenclature has changed, that it is indigenous people. So you don't use nomenclatures like original inhabitants, aboriginals, so that there will be no confusion. So you have that wholesome definition, so that when you're talking about the indigenous rights of people, you know that the indigenous people are people who can lay claim to a certain place because of their culture, which is the same definition for aboriginals that you have. So as not to make that confusion about definitions and distinctions and how to determine their rights, you have that. For instance, if you go up to the Americas also, you have people, Canadians, you have people who say they're aboriginals there. But right now, the whole...
You have people who also call themselves Native Americans.
Native, yes.
Particularly
exactly.
in New Mexico and
exactly.
And
so you have
yes.
natives, either they call themselves natives, aboriginals, original inhabitants, but everybody is put under the description of indigenous person, because at the end of the day, when you look at the different definitions and the different nomenclature, you're actually talking about original people who have lived in a place, who have a distinct culture, who have a distinct rights. But because of most times, the reason why all of these issues are coming up is because of development. And some of these people who are close to natural resources site are the ones who usually get displaced. And once the development is coming up, you see, they are marginalized politically, they are marginalized economically, their original rights, the way they do things, they have this way, they preserve their rivers, they preserve their forests. By the time development comes there, it's that they're taken away from them, they lose all of those. And this is directly linked to the issue of history. So when aboriginals are talking about, oh, we are the real people, the original people, or the natives of this place, they're also referring to themselves as indigenous persons, just to make it clear for everybody to understand that what we are talking about is the indigenous person. And like I said earlier, I learned also recently when we went to the 16th expert mechanism on the rights of indigenous persons, we're told that the description is not original inhabitants, but the indigenous persons, so that everybody will be on the same table when you are having those discussions.
Flowing from that, Hansfree, you understand that in many parts of Latin America today, there are agitations by the so-called indigenous peoples for various rights. And this arises from what she said now, where development has caught up with them or met with them, or greater populations have come up to meet up with them in their natural habitat, and have that has overwhelmed them and taken over either their culture or even their language. Do we have such situations in Nigeria today?
Absolutely, absolutely. We have very clear situations like that in Nigeria. And Faith has already let the cat out of the bag, mentioning the original inhabitants in the FCT. Let me just say a word on those, the nomenclature. Outside the UN context, there are some groups that actually want to identify in terms of been described as aboriginal. Some will say they are autochthonous. Some will also say they are, the First Nations, that have inhabited those places. So those nomenclatures are used interchangeably depending on the context and depending on the struggle, because the struggle also decides or determines what are the issues at stake that the original inhabitants, or the indigenous people are fighting for. In the context of Nigeria, we have the Ogoni people, for example, who, if you read the reports, various UN reports talking about the indigenous people, the Ogoni people feature very prominently. And that's why in the course of our own project of promoting the rights of original inhabitants in the FCT, we've tried to bring these indigenous groups across, Nigeria to interact and also have conversations, among themselves, learn from each other's struggles, and learn some of the techniques and the methods that have been successful, the best practices, the promising practices. Some of those things are, have been really very key in the course of the work we have done. So we are working directly with the FCT original inhabitant. In their own case, there are clear issues of political marginalization. There are, issues of economic exclusion, and also there's the threats of cultural extinction, which the original inhabitant or the indigenous people of the FCT face. And that, issue recently, a part of it was answered with the nomination of an indigenous person from the FCT as a minister to the federal cabinet, which for us is a landmark. It begins the process, which we described it as the first bold step to start redressing the decades-long injustices that the FCT indigenous people have faced since their lands were taken over to make way for Nigeria's Center of Unity. We feel strongly, and we canvassed this very strongly when we appeared before the UN expert mechanism. And we talked a lot about the fact that the Nigerian state needs to also come up to speed with some of the international instruments and some of the international opportunities, because like the expert mechanism we attended, it was not just for the indigenous people to come and complain about their plight. It was also a space for engagement between the government and the indigenous people. For example, we can take a best practice from New Zealand, where their indigenous people now have a full ministry dedicated to indigenous issues. So that's the kind of example we want to see in Nigeria, which is why when we engaged the expert mechanism, we also talked and advocated for a what they call country engagement, because within the context of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, every country should have an engagement where it engages its indigenous people. Some states who do not want to respect the rights of indigenous people try to stall those engagements. They don't want to talk and dialogue with the people and listen to the people and let the people say what their wishes and their aspirations are. So our own role as civil society is to ensure that we facilitate that dialogue, raise the issues as much as possible, bring it to the public domain, and ensure that our people who are indigenous people have the opportunity to state their issues.
Well, just before we bring in Jacob Sananu, who is an FCT youth, let's clarify this issue. Would I be correct, would anyone be correct to say perhaps recognition for indigenous groups would be their ability to struggle, to put their matters in the front burner, as has been stated in the case of the Ogoni, for instance, the original inhabitants of the FCT? Would that be one of the criteria for recognizing them as indigenous peoples? Because there may be others who do not have the kind of opportunity and the voice for this kind of struggle for recognition.
Actually, I think it's about information. Those others who who are not speaking up, who don't have the voice and don't have that kind of visibility, may not have the information to do that. Because the whole idea around, like he mentioned, the 16th expert mechanism. The expert mechanism is made up of only 7 persons who gather information from the indigenous groups and then advise governments on how they can handle indigenous people's issues. So if your group is an indigenous group and you don't have that information, that you can actually begin to rise up and ask for recognition, nobody will come out to give it to you. Rather, people will want to take it away from you. And most times when you look around the world globally, all of the issues that indigenous people are fighting for is really around resources, because most indigenous people live very close to where the resource is, and then it's about coming to take away those resources without recognizing the people who are there, without including them in the development that is happening. So he just mentioned the issue of the Ogonis. We are talking about the issue of the FCT and so many others. I have told you that some of the indigenous groups that are recognized in Nigeria, for instance, in fact, the largest indigenous community you have today in Nigeria is in Oyo. Say that's where you have the largest indigenous community, you know. And these people, when you talk about the issues around their resources, around being able to be part of, you know, exercising the right to develop those resources for the entire good, you see that the percentage of people from those indigenous groups are far more less than the percentage of people who come in, who migrate to that place in the name of development or using of that. So if people don't have the information, that is why it is important that this kind of information is going out. People have the information, they're able to begin, I don't want to use the word agitation, they begin to advocate for inclusion, self-determination, preservation of culture, which is most important, and then also using indigenous knowledge in peace building. Because these people have their own, I call it native intelligence on how they have handled issues around those areas, around those natural resources where Africans come on. And we know that our ancestors have preserved these things over the years. Some of these things that we're using as development, building on all of them, and we are destroying them. These are some of the things that some of the other climes outside our African setting are using for revenue income into the country. Let me shock you a little. There's a hill not too far from here, Apo Hills, very close to the Apo, they call it Apo Hills, but it's actually Gariki Hills. On that hill is buried 16 chiefs who have led the Gariki chiefdom. 16 chiefs are buried on that hill. The 17th chief is here to be buried. The 18th chief is ruling now. Just imagine that you let this history go and you give that hill as a concession. The person who doesn't understand that history, the ties that the Gariki people have to that history, will come and just blast it. And you have lost a whole generation of culture, of history that the people want to, you know, align with for that type of development. And that is why it is important that you have this kind of conversation. So around Nigeria, you have small indigenous groups who are there, but because they don't have this information, that one, there's already a United Nations Declaration on the Protection of the Rights of Indigenous Persons, that every country that is signed on to the United Nations has an obligation to see how to develop and include indigenous people into their development. And so you have those people who, because they don't have that information, they don't have people to talk for them, they seem to as if they don't have the voice. Globally now, right now, nobody, even when we went to the UN, people were talking about the rights of the Ogoni people. Now, for the first time, we took the original inhabitants issue there. Imagine that Nigeria as a country will now have like a policy around attending to indigenous persons. And you know, it's not really easy. There are countries who came there, I can't remember the exact country now. The indigenous people, they came, they made a statement concerning their situation, and the government came and made a counter statement. So it was more like a back and forth. So most times you have governments who don't really understand that you have to protect these rights of people, integrate them into development, use them for peace building and for economic development. They don't understand that, and then keep having this back and forth and prolongs the issue. There was a country from the Americas that came, this last time they came to America, made it the 100th year.
Since they have
been agitating and advocating for the protection of their rights.
All right, let's quickly turn our attention to Jacob Sananu, who is from the FCT. Jacob, thank you so much for finding time to join us. Hello,
Yes,
Jacob.
good
Yes.
afternoon.
Good afternoon. Now,
Good afternoon, sir.
yes,
Yes.
why do you think we should consider the original inhabitants of the FCT as indigenous people of Nigeria?
All right. Thank you very much for having me here. It is pertinent that the people of FCT should be considered as the indigenous people of Abuja because before the advent of the creation or the relocation of FCT from Lagos to Abuja, our great grandparents have lived here for hundreds of years. And since the initial policy of total relocation of the indigenous people from Abuja to their mother state did not hold water. So we are here, we have nowhere to go. And the only best thing for us is to be integrated and to be treated as bona fide citizens of this country. Thank you very much, sir.
So what are those things that you think are being denied you and your people of the FCT that
Oh,
you think should qualify you to be recognized as indigenous peoples of the FCT along the lines of the UN declaration?
sir, there are so many. One of it is the political deprivation. We lack quota system in FCT, like the issue of the ministerial slots from among us, even the educational aspect too. We don't used to have quota system in JAM. Most of us will have to travel out to other states to go and register for JAM before we are considered. Then, culturally too, most of our cultural sites have been blasted due to the development activities, mining and quarry activities. So a lot of things are happening around us here that seriously, if nothing is done about it, our identity is at the verge of getting disappeared.
Now, how well have you and your people raised these issues, and to what level have you really carried out this advocacy to get this kind of recognition that you seek?
Hello?
Can you hear me, Jacob?
Hello, sir. Hello, sir.
Yes, I'm asking you how well and how far you and your people in the FCT have carried this advocacy for recognition that you seek.
Oh, it's been for a decade now. We have inherited this from our parents, from our uncles, and we are taking over from them. We have staged a lot of protests. We've gone to court to seek for redress. And we've done a lot of things to see that our rights are being restored back to us. So it is not a fight that we are going to stop until the needful is done. We are not going to rest on our hours.
Do you think that the legal option is a viable option in this regard?
Yes, sir. We have explored all of that, not until recently that our president decided to have a very beautiful recognition of our identity, and he has decided to remark us, and it's like it is in compliance with the court order of 2018. So we've gone to court, we have explored the court orders. I mean, we have explored the avenues in the court to get our rights. And not until recently, that has been observed duly. And sometimes if the court fails to do the needful, we will continue to sustain the advocacy and until no, we are there. We will not give up. We will not give up. So, yeah, but we have always tried to be law-abiding citizens 247. We have never been identified with violence. We have never been identified with druggery. And our plea is that may our patience never be taken for granted.
All right, stay with us, Jacob. Let me turn to you, Hans Free. Jacob just talked about the legal option. Looking globally, do you know of anywhere else where either the aborigines, the natives, or the indigenous peoples have sought the legal channel to
Yes.
get recognition and it has worked?
Yes, so we've had several of those cases. Whether you talk about New Zealand, whether you talk about even Kenya. Kenya recently, a few months ago, recorded a landmark case relating to the lands of the Ogive, called the Ogive people. That was use of some form of judicial activism to invoke, these rights, because there are clear connections, between the declarations and some of the legal provisions we have within constitutions of countries that can be invoked and used, to pressure, authorities to ensure that they listen to the cries of these indigenous people. For example, at the Resource Center for Human Rights and Civic Education, we have actually supported the legal option because particularly we have seen that the original inhabitants in the FCT, they have been very law-abiding people. They have patiently, for close to 5 decades, tried to raise their voice, and which is why when our project came on board, what we tried to do was not to take over the struggles of the FCT original inhabitants, but rather to energize the struggles by building their capacity for them to be able to, because it's the person who is wearing the shoes that knows where it pinches the most, and we don't want to shove them aside and advocate for them. No, we want them to be at the forefront of the advocacy. That was why at the UN expert mechanism, there were no less than 8 FCT original inhabitants that our organization took there, get them to sit in sessions, get them to interact with other indigenous groups from other parts of the world. For instance, we're able to get them to even have conversation in panel discussions around issues of livelihood. For example, fishing, crafts, their kind of unique cloth making. And I can tell you, sir, that when we arrived in Geneva, the original inhabitants, from their dressing, they stole the show, practically, because people saw the uniqueness in their mode of dressing, which is a dimension of their culture. People were also able to hear about, the unique art forms like the pottery, which is a very vibrant art form here in the FCT. And so, we're able to create those networks. As a matter of fact, there were even organizations who committed to working with the FCT original inhabitants to take their advocacy forward. I think I would like to make a final point about, this need for synergy, not just within the country, but outside the country. The people faith, the indigenous people faith mentioned earlier on that when they came to the expert mechanism, then their government also came to counter them. They are called the Chagosian people of Mauritius. Yes. So they are actually raising their voice over the location of a military base right in their ancestral homeland that has just made life, unbearable for, for them. And they approached us during the expert mechanism. They wanted to speak with the Nigerian, delegation that, came for the event, and we're able to find areas, because their issue is actually very similar to the issues of the, FCT original inhabitants. Because what is at stake is the question of land. Land grabbing. You just grab somebody's land. There's no compensation. You don't actually even think about what would happen to the person's culture. If the person's identity disappears and the person becomes like a cultural mulatto, it's not your problem. So, that's the kind of situation. So we were able to create those synergies, and going forward, working towards the next expert mechanism, those synergies would build up in the forms of joint statements from African delegations, to the expert mechanism, and also, more importantly, is the country engagement. We want, and that's part of our advocacy, that human rights institutions like the National Human Rights Commission should also become like a leader from the state institutions in kind of championing this process, such that we can have a meeting point between the state authorities and also the indigenous people for a larger conversation that would lead to resolution of some of these issues. We also make no mistake about the fact that all the issues cannot be resolved in one fell swoop. But like we saw in the case of New Zealand, substantial progress is made, and as you take one very bold step forward, then you create confidence. You boost the confidence of the indigenous people that you are actually really interested in addressing the injustices that have been done to them.
Back home here in Nigeria, Faith, does the Nigerian government have any policy around the treatment of indigenous peoples? Is there any instrument, whether in our constitution or in our extant laws, that actually recognize the rights of indigenous peoples, or recognize indigenous peoples in the first instance, and to say, look, this is the policy towards them? Because from your description, if a country does not have such kind of robust policy, it will be difficult for a country to go to the UN to go and present a counter argument to what the indigenous peoples of that country are talking about. It's just talked about Mauritius. The Chagosians
Yeah.
presented their case, but the Mauritian government also had a counter argument.
Yes. Yeah, to my knowledge, we don't really have. The only place where we have mentioned the FCT is in the Constitution, where the FCT is described more or less like a state. The problem we have with the FCT and why the government does not have such a policy is because of the fact of the matter that those who came to carry out the first survey of the FCT actually put into the literature that the FCT was a no man's land. So government was not under any obligation to begin to look at who was on ground here. So it was about, this is a no man's land, this is a virgin ground, we can just move the few people that are there without looking at them. And we have done the development of the FCT based on that literature, based on that understanding that it was a no man's land, until it was suddenly discovered that they have 9 distinct tribes that were existing with their distinct culture, their way of life and everything within the FCT. So one of the advocacies we have always had is that the federal government should come out with a distinct policy on how to address indigenous peoples and their rights, so that when you have that kind of policy, you can align that to the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Persons. Nigeria is one of those countries that sits at the table, that recognizes this, but we have not come to domesticate that law in our laws in the country. Because if you have that, that would be one basis for you to begin to even demand for the protection of your rights and recognition of your person and your culture. Now, there are diverse tribes and cultures within Nigeria, which is part of our strength, but we have not come up with policies that will look at these distinct cultures and be able to bring out programs to address the injustices that have been meted out over these people over the years. Take, for instance, when we started this project with Christed, and we started the advocacy, we found out that one way of even giving succor to the people live within Abuja, was to have a distinct traditional piece, maybe at the city gate, just like you have in Lagos. When you are going into Lagos, you recognize the 3 Eyo structure that is there. You begin to feel a sense of the culture of the people that live in that vicinity. But as you are coming into Abuja, there's really nothing that shows you that this land belonged to certain people before it opened up. It does for every other part of Nigeria to come in. So if we had such policies in place, it becomes easy to even begin to look at having those kind of traditional pieces in place. And also to just say something about the question you asked Arms Free around the legal instruments. Recently, not too long ago, in Tanzania, there's a group that is called the Hadzabe people in Tanzania. They were given rights to their forests. These people originally are hunters. So because of development, people, and the fact that their land was taken away from them, people were allowed access into their forests. But just recently, through using the legal means, they recovered their forests. Now they have gone back to begin to use their traditional means to preserve their forests, preserve the animals in their forests. And in just about 6 months or 1 year, we're beginning to hear reports that the forest is being revitalized because they are using those and helping to improve the revenue of Tanzania. So just imagine, at the time the government had taken over that place, they did it, and that struggle took about 40 years to come about. That struggle took about 40 years for the people to be able to recover that. So when you talk about using legal instruments, at times it doesn't usually come because of the absence of policies, because of the absence of laws. So you are not able to key in that particular injustice to a particular law. But you have other general laws that talk about the rights of people to assemble, the right preservation of people's culture and that, but you don't have a particular policy that is addressing the Declaration of the United Nations on the protection of the indigenous people in Nigeria.
I will ask Jacob this question, and I'll ask you too. The Land Use Act in Nigeria says all land is vested in the federal and to a large extent to state governments, which of course means that it has taken ownership of the land from the original people who owned this land.
Yeah.
How do you then reconcile that with the agitation? Because land and resources is at the center of the struggles, of the advocacy of the indigenous peoples.
So that's why we've had a lot of these agitations, and you would not, or we cannot run away from the fact that even the Land Use Act is a vestige of military, military rule, and
which has now become an act of parliament.
Yes. But instructively, part of the discussion we had, during the expert mechanism was the role of militarization, because if you have come to use, military might is right, approach to take something away from the people, and if we go to the particular example of the FCT people, they are not saying we are not sharing the resource. That's not their point. The point they are making is that we also have a right to participate in this resource. If you are allocating land, given the Land Use Act vests the land, but you cannot vest the land in a manner that you give the ancestral lands of people to other people, and then you deprive the very people who actually own those lands. That's not justice. That in a sense, it might be lawful, but not every law advances the cause of justice. And so for us to have a situation in which everybody is carried along, everybody is included, we must come to a point in terms of sharing and allocating resources in a way that includes everybody and gives everybody a voice on the table. This is a core part of the agitation. During the expert mechanism, we saw cases of people in Russia. There were some fishing communities in Russia who also had representation to talk about how their livelihoods were being affected because fishing trawlers would just come in where they were doing just small traditional fishing. Fishing trawlers come and overrun the place. It may be lawful for those trawlers to do that, but is it justice that you push? So if there's a conflict between the law and justice, if there's a conflict between the law and doing right by the other people who are also our fellow citizens, in the context of Nigeria, then we have to find a way to accommodate some of those issues.
Jacob, I'm sure that very many people for the first time will be hearing that there are 9 distinct tribes in the FCT. Very many people may be hearing that for the first time because the assumption is that, oh, there's just one tribe in the FCT, the Gwaris, what have you, who are not only in the FCT, but are also in other states like Niger, like Kogi, and possibly parts of Nasarawa. Now, how has that affected your struggle? Jacob, we are listening to you.
Yes, sir. The network really went bad. Can you?
Yes, I'm saying.
Yes, I can get you now. Please, can you summarize the question, please?
My question is that very many Nigerians will be hearing for the first time that there are 9 distinct tribes in the FCT. Up until now, many people may have thought that there's just one ethnic group in the FCT, the Gwaris. And the Gwaris are also in Nasarawa, they are in Kogi, they are in Niger, and maybe 2 parts of Kaduna. And that kind of spread, how has it affected your struggle in the FCT?
Yes, we have 9 different ethnic groups in FCT, and the struggle has been has not been without challenges, but notwithstanding, they say there is strength in diversity. So the collection of the 9 indigenous group has given us the strength to really push central and the northwestern part of Nigeria. And we are still pushing on with the struggles alongside with our brothers and sisters like the Koro, Gede, Ghana, Ibera, Bari, and Amwamwa. These are the 9 ethnic groups we have in FCT. So there is strength in diversity. So we are exploring our differences to push on with the struggle for the emancipation of our people in FCT. We having the 9 ethnic group in FCT is not a challenge. It's rather giving us an edge, an advantage to keep pushing on until we get.
All right, thank you so much, Jacob. Let me come back to you, Faith. And now we talked earlier on about the international instruments in this advocacy, in this struggle for the recognition of the indigenous peoples, particularly in Nigeria. He talked about how the livelihoods of indigenous peoples are being affected by industrialization, by modernization and all of that. And that has been one of the agitations of persons in the south of Nigeria who say oil exploration and exploitation has completely ruined their livelihoods. Can those people also be regarded as indigenous peoples?
Yes, of course. You know, the indigenous struggle is always mostly around resources of a people. Let's take the Niger Delta people, for instance. The fact that there's continuous exploration of oil and gas within that sector, the livelihood of the people, which is usually farming and fishing, is mostly completely eroded. I don't want to use the word completely, but it's mostly eroded. Now you have issues that come with those implementation of extractives that you have, the crude oil spillages that you have, destroying homes, destroying normal way of doing things, flaring of gas and all those things, reduces life expectancy, reduces economic mainstay of the people, reduces political inclusion, because at the time these contracts are being signed and agreed, there is no person from that community that is sitting on the table to say, yes, to say, this is what we used to do, what are you going to do to help us do that? And that's one thing we have also brought into the use of the community development agreements as a tool to preserving the culture of the indigenous people. Now we have a law, the Solid Minerals Act 2007 in this country, and a little portion of that talks about a community development agreement, that before you go into a community to exploit solid minerals, you need to sit down with that community and come up with a 5-year community development agreement. We saw that within the FCT, there's so many communities where quarrying activities are happening and going on, some others mining activities, gold is being mined in the FCT, and some of the community people don't even know that there is that instrument called the Community Development Agreement that the companies would have engaged them with to actually first-hand get information about preserving their livelihood. So you get a community development agreement, somebody is coming into the community, is telling you, I want to build a chief palace, or I want to give money for RAM, I want to give money for Christmas, and all of those things. And people are just happy, not knowing that signing that, you're actually signing out your rights to those resources. One way of beneficiation of getting back from those resources is being able to sign the community development agreement in such a way that you are able to preserve even your culture, ensure there's environmental protection, and ensure that your livelihood is also protected. Peradventure, your livelihood is destroyed because of the activities of that company. There should be a way to agree within that community development agreement on what the company should do. Yes, remediation. But it's not the same thing with the oil and gas sector, but this is what happens within this solid mineral sector. And perhaps the PIA that we have will now begin to have that, when you talked about community participation in the PIA, we'll be able to now look at that. The only thing that we have, that we need to do, like I talked about the issue of information. If communities don't have information that these instruments are there, that can help them get a little back from that resources, which is the reason, one, for their displacement, two, for the displacement of their livelihoods, economic mainstay, and reduction of life expectancy, they may not be able to utilize those instruments properly, because right now those are the low-hanging fruit, I would say, that communities can use to preserve a little of what is already being eroded. And if we don't go it the right way, without the real political, what is the word that I'm trying to get, commitment from government to ensure that they do that, it means that we will still go around the circle and nothing will be achieved with that.
Information
yes.
is key. Information is key to answer in 30 seconds.
Yeah.
Well, yes.
Yes, so number one, I think there is room for more groups within Nigeria, that are indigenous groups, to actually get their voices here, heard, using the instrumentality of the UN system, whether you talk about the declaration itself or the expert mechanism, or even the permanent forum on indigenous rights. So there is a lot, of room for that. The final point is that indigenous issues are also about the stability of the country, because if the country includes everybody, if he listens to the voices of everybody, then all of these separatist agitations you are hearing, all of these agitations all over the place will calm down.
So inclusiveness is strength.
Yeah, it is the interest of Nigeria to
thank you so much.
Everybody.
Right. Hansri Ajanaku is a program and communications manager, Resource Center for Human Rights and Civic Education. Thank you so much for coming on the program. And Faith Nwadishi is the Executive Director, Center for Transparency Advocacy. Thank you very much for coming. And of course, we were also joined by Jacob Sananu, who is an indigene of the FCT and one of its youth leaders. Thank you so much, Jacob, for finding time to join us on the program. And wish you the very best in your struggles and in your advocacy. Thank you so much. Well, that's the program for today. Thank you for investing your time with us, and we look forward to bringing you a fresh edition of People, Politics, and Power. Bye for now.